Hi everyone, and welcome to the Fake Love and Flying Monkeys podcast. My name's Nova Gibson and I am your host. My area of expertise is in supporting victims and survivors of narcissistic abuse and other toxic relationships. I'm the principal counsellor at Brighter Outlook Narcissistic Abuse Counselling Service, and I'm also the author of Fake Love, Understanding and Healing from Narcissistic Abuse. In this podcast, we're going to be talking about everything from the initial pink cloud you find yourself on at the start through to the horrific discard and the powerful trauma bond that keeps you hooked. So take your imaginary seat on the roller coaster that is narcissistic abuse, and don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode of Fake Love and Flying Monkeys. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Fake Love and Flying Monkeys. I have very special guests all the time, but tonight I have someone extra special for you. I am so excited to talk to Chris Daw. Chris is a King's Counsel, KC, in the UK, and he has just so much experience in some really high profile cases. Chris, I could go on forever announcing you, but I'd really love for you to introduce yourself and especially to tell everyone about your social media presence in terms of your BBC show and of course your book, and maybe touch on some of the high profile cases you've done before we get into.
Well, it's really good to join you, and thank you for having me. You're right. My name's Chris Daw. I'm a barrister. I've been practicing in criminal law mostly for the last 30-something years. And over recent years, I've become, I guess, a commentator on legal issues. I wrote a book called Justice on Trial, which, as the name suggests, is very much an analysis of all of the things that are wrong with our justice system in Britain and also in the United States, and also looking at some of the things that are maybe being done a bit better in other countries like European and Norwegian and the Scandinavian countries. And I also made a TV show for the BBC over here called Crime, Are We Tough Enough?, which again was looking at the sort of the problems that we have in a criminal justice system when there's too many people who want something out of the system, and simply not enough resources in the system to provide what I think most people would see as a reasonable and safe level of policing and criminal justice. Particularly, I know in cases of domestic violence and coercive and controlling behaviour, and that sort of area, which I think is often one of the most common issues with the criminal justice system to deal with, and always has been. But I think it's the one area, or one of the many areas actually, where we're particularly bad at helping victims, at reducing future offending by offenders, and we simply don't, I think, at the moment have a joined up approach to these kinds of issues. So I've spent a number of years writing about this, thinking about this, and I'm happy to to just go into whatever detail you like about the criminal justice system generally, which I know many of the issues in the UK are reflected in your experiences in Australia. Yeah. And in other countries and other jurisdictions. It has to be said, often English-speaking countries have some of the worst criminal justice systems. I don't know why that might be, in terms of protection from domestic and other forms of violence. But we've got to have conversations about what's wrong and how we're letting people down, and hopefully at some point someone will start listening.
Yeah, absolutely. So many people out there might know this, but my daughter is a lawyer, and I sometimes have conversations with her, and sometimes we come to loggerheads because I come from a counselling perspective and she's like, no, Mum, this is the law, okay? And she's coming from the legal perspective. And while we come to loggerheads, it's just so good to get that perspective, because it matters in the end. The law is the law, and we can only do what we can do. So I really want to get your perspective, Chris, in particular in this episode about stalking. Now, stalking in Australia. I don't know what it's like in the UK, but I think I was reading the Australian Bureau of Statistics today where someone will have like 100 stalking incidents before they actually report. And there's so many factors that go into that. They don't think they'll be believed. But I guess there's a pattern of behaviour where they report or they hear of others reporting and they get told, to go away, that there's not enough evidence, a crime hasn't been committed, and then people are losing their lives. And really, it's like intimate terrorism because these victims can't leave their home. And I think 80% of the stalking these days, because of the prevalence of social media now, it's been in the form of cyberstalking, and it can be really difficult to prove. So what are your thoughts on, I guess, what victims should do and what is going on in terms of justice, and which would make them feel better about coming forward instead of making their abuser angrier?
Well, I think you make some good points, and I think there's some really difficult and challenging discussions to be had, for all of us to have about how we deal with a form of criminal behaviour, whether it be sort of personal, sort of face-to-face stalking, or I suppose IRL stalking, as younger people would call it, or through social media and other kind of remote communications. The truth is that this is such a huge issue. There's such a huge number of victims, particularly of the online and cyber stalking variety.
Yeah.
That we in Britain just do not have the resource to cope with that. In order to investigate a case thoroughly requires many hours of police time, as well as the technological resources to analyse that evidence and then produce it to a standard that can be used in a court. And all of that takes a lot of time, even if you do have a full team of officers who are specialists and know what they're dealing with, and who are given, the backup and the support and the resources. But the truth is, we don't have those things in this country, and I don't think you have them in Australia. So often, those victims who do go to the police, who do try at least to take a perpetrator through the criminal courts and through the justice system, most of them, it never gets to court. And if it does, many of those cases fail, or the victim gives up before the case gets to trial because of delay, because as you say, often the reporting of a stalking situation can lead to the stalker becoming more aggressive and more relentless in their behaviour, ironically. And that's telling you, I think, that there is something seriously wrong with our society, that there is so much of this behaviour going on, but also with the systems that we have in place supposedly to help and support victims. And I think the one thing, perhaps the biggest issue in many ways, is not the criminal justice system, because that has so many failures, but the lack of resource to support victims of stalking and domestic violence who may need help with accommodation or avoiding an attacker, or even just something as simple as being able to afford a new phone or a new phone number so that they can very quickly cut off the sources of contact. So there are things that can and should be done to support victims, regardless of whether they choose to engage with the criminal process or not. But if they do, then absolutely, there's so much more support and resource needed. But are we as societies prepared to commit to those resources and the consequences of a much more expanded criminal justice approach to stalking? At the moment, there's no political will in this country, in the UK, to raise the taxes we would need to create that infrastructure around victims, and that is I think in the end the major problem is lack of resource.
Lack of resources. Would you say that resources? Yeah, I 100% agree that police have got so many strings to their bow, and they're undermanned and probably underpaid, and they've got a dangerous job, etc. But would you say, as a society, that the attitude towards stalking, in terms of there's no bruises, there's no visible injuries, and that's maybe why it kind of gets put to the bottom of the pile in terms of resources?
I don't necessarily think so. I think it's, you're right, of course, that if someone presents at hospital with serious injuries, physical injuries, then there's going to be an immediate police response and probably an immediate arrest of the perpetrator. Whereas where there is no physical injury, where there is no sign of that somebody has been physically hurt, it's more difficult for the police, I think, to kind of to investigate thoroughly. It certainly takes a lot longer. It's certainly not going to be treated with the same degree of urgency. Yeah. And so you're right that when it, I suppose it's the same in anything. The most obvious victims, those who are visibly injured and visibly distressed after an acute incident of some kind, are much more likely to get a rapid and effective police response. Yeah. But even then, how long that response lasts in terms of protection of a victim, often people sadly are seriously physically hurt as a result of attacks in a domestic violence or relationship setting, and still the justice system lets them down, and still they don't really have any effective support as they navigate that system. So I think what we need to do in a way is ask ourselves, what do we really want? What do we expect to happen if any of us are subjected to relentless, coercive, controlling, or other forms of direct stalking behaviour? What do we want? What's the response that we want? And how does that fit in with all the other priorities and demands that we make of our police? And I think over the years, I've seen across a range of criminal justice policy areas, of which this is one, time and again, the system isn't geared up to cope with the size of the problem and to provide the support that's needed for victims. So how do we change the system? Do we look to divert cases from the criminal justice system altogether? Do we look to find other ways to deal with these cases that may involve sort of a voluntary kind of admission of guilt and then some degree of measures being put in place as an alternative to prosecution? Maybe that would be more effective in some cases. But it's a very, very difficult problem, which as a society, we all have to make our choices. What do we want our tax money spent on? And, that the priority at the moment certainly is not victims of stalking and other forms of domestic abuse or of course stranger stalking as well.
Yeah, well, in Australia, and I think in some places in the UK that we've now got coercive control legislation, or in some states. I think New South Wales, it's come into play now, and next year it comes into play in Queensland, and I'm pretty sure that it's in certain places in the UK. But it's about, as you said, how do you prove coercive control when it's so insidious, and how do you, what deterrence do you put in place? Because most abusers who are going to engage in that really insidious, sneaky behaviour, rather than, being overt and being out there where it's visible, they don't care about a piece of paper. They're going to throw away, a restraining order or use it for firewood, whatever they do with it, because to them it's all about power and control, and they won't be told what to do by anyone. And what I'm hearing in Australia from victims, and I wanted to talk about a really sad case that, well, there's many of them, but one in particular. But what they're saying is that when they finally do come forward, the punishment, it's not working. These people, these abusers that engage in this stalking behaviour and terrorising and intimidating their victim, they're getting, like, I think I read in the stats, the maximum is 4 years and the minimum is 0.17, with a median of 1 year. Now, that's for the cases that are actually go through to prosecution and jail time. So how many other cases, you can only assume that would be a monumental figure that don't get that far because of the lack of evidence. So what is the deterrent?
Well, I'm not sure that there is one ever provided by the criminal justice system. And I think this is one of the problems, is that we as a society, you know, if you read any media coverage of the criminal justice system in this country or any other, it tends to end up with an argument as to whether or not we're too soft or too tough, or where we sit on that spectrum. And the analysis that you've just made, well, you know, the maximum sentence is 4 years and the average is 1 year. Well, I'm not sure how anybody, when you stand back from the just numbers and the desire for people to be punished, etc., which I understand the thinking that goes into that, but when you stand back from it, the truth is that people who engage in this sort of behaviour they're not sort of reading the news to find out what the latest sentence was in another case to see whether they're going to do it or not. Because is it going to make the difference if they're going to get 1 year or 2 or 5 or even 10?
No.
Because that's not how the human mind works, and people behave this way because they have psychological issues, flaws, behaviour traits, which, as it were, unafraid of punishment or unafraid of prison. And the other problem with, I think, particularly as if you look to increase prison sentences, and you've got to think about the cost of that for a start, because in England it costs around £50,000. I think that's about 100,000 Australian dollars, thereabouts, a year to keep someone in prison. And when you think about what you could do with that money to try to work to avoid future offending, rather than simply warehousing someone temporarily for a year or 2 or however many years, I think we need to come up with more clever use of our money than simply looking to lock people up for longer. Not least because generally we do lock people up for very long sentences. When they come out, they're even more dangerous and even more violent than when they went in, and that is the fundamental flaw in our system. Is that even when it works, in inverted commas, that someone is arrested, charged, convicted, and sentenced, that does nothing to change the future for the individual victim, or indeed for other victims in the future. So the idea that we should look to more pragmatic ways to deal with this behaviour, so in a way that is more cost effective and more effective in preventing future behaviours, and that's where I think we should be heading, rather than simply saying to ourselves the system's broken because only 1% of offenders ever see a courtroom. Well, if you think about that, even if you increase the number by 500%, so that 5% of victims had their day in court, that still leaves the vast overwhelming majority of cases that don't actually go through the system, and you still have to deal with those cases, whether or not you're prosecuting people or you're not prosecuting people. In my opinion, what you should be looking to do is put this a support network or a support system in place for victims from the very beginning, that has a clear path to them avoiding future incidents with the perpetrator, and a clear route to enforcing the exclusion of that perpetrator from a certain distance from the victim. And we just don't have the resource, and we're not doing that properly. That's where I think we should focus our attention, protect the victims, rather than expecting the criminal justice system to actually change behaviours, because in the real world it doesn't do that.
And I know that we had this conversation last time we spoke, Chris, and I'm in agreement with you in terms of the prison system. It's not working. They're coming out worse than they go in, because there's no I guess education and support to deal with what caused them to be this way, whether it be, a low socioeconomic status, abuse when they were a child, whatever their parents went through. But from my perspective and the victims that I work with, victims of domestic violence, I kind of think that, yes, that may be the case with someone who maybe robs a bank. Let's say they rob a bank and they want money for drugs. They've fallen into a really terrible lifestyle because of poverty and many other things that have happened to them when they grow up. And they get the really, really long sentences, or sometimes they do, and they get let out and they're not reformed. But someone who's stalking and terrorizing someone, and it seemed to be a lesser crime, those people are doing it specifically to terrorize and intimidate and control a victim and absolutely destroy their life forever if they can. And they are getting the lesser sentence, I guess I'm saying. In my opinion, I think they should be the ones that get locked up for longer, and the ones we should be concentrating on are the ones there's more potential for change rather than, locking them up forever. What do you think about that?
It's very difficult, isn't it? Because I think there are two different ways of looking at crime and punishment and sentencing, and one way is that it's really good, and because if you catch people doing something serious, you really come down hard on them, you lock them up for a very long time, and that the victim has a sense of justice, and we as citizens feel that something's being done about a problem, which is a very significant problem in our society. But that analysis is understandable. But the problem with the analysis is that it just doesn't work. Even if you did for example, if you were to reverse the system, and you're right that in the UK it's just the same, that if you're caught for selling a small amount of cannabis, you're likely to get a longer sentence, or at least the same sort of sentence as you would get for stalking or even physical domestic abuse. And that you could say, well, okay, that's wrong. We should just reverse the position and give much longer sentences for one group and then take away the sentence from the other. But you have, for me, and one of the reasons I've started writing about this and making television about this is because I think none of those arguments really look at the evidence of what really works. And for me, I think the starting point has to be not what's our instinctive view that, the sentences for these crimes are clearly too long, sentences for these crimes are too soft. What matters is what's the evidence about how you protect victims and how you protect society from people who commit these types of acts. Yeah. And all the evidence is clear that the more you use prison as your solution to those problems, and the more you use very long sentences as a solution to those problems, the worse your outcomes will be in the long run, because you will spend a huge amount of money actually just slightly or often intensely over criminalizing individuals and making them more criminal and more violent in their outlook, more violent in their behavior. So how do you deal with that? And I think you have to, in some ways, you have to look to your profession. You have to look to the psychology behind a lot of these crimes, because you will know as well as anyone that much of the behavior involved here, there is a degree of psychological compulsion towards being a controlling individual. Some of it, in many cases, does come from childhood experiences and childhood traumas. And the truth is that only by addressing and dealing head on with whatever is the motivating psychological factor, the reason why an offender keeps doing this kind of thing, then they won't stop. And often, I mean, you'll have seen cases, and there have been some high profile cases around the world of this, but often it makes no difference. If someone who's involved in stalking gets arrested, they get locked up, and they come back again a year or two, and they still carry on doing it because you haven't actually dealt with whatever that psychological trigger is that's making this person behave this way. Now, some people say, well, you can castrate them, or you can lock them up for forever or something like that, and that would stop them. And in relation to an individual, that there may be some value in that, but the problem is the numbers are so great. There are so many people who are committing these kind of behaviors across a whole spectrum, from short-term, low-level stalking, if you can call it that, to relentless 24/7 stalking that goes on for years and does include breaking into homes, damaging property, frightening people in a whole range of ways, including physical assault. So there is a big spectrum there, and at one end, yes, you can see there's a need for public protection, but at the other end, the numbers are so large that if we lock up all of those people involved in any form of stalking activity or what could be defined as controlling and coercive behavior, we're going to need to double our prison spaces just for those people. And the outcome at the other end of that is not necessarily going to be the one we want, because we're not necessarily going to end up with a big group of people who are suddenly cured because they've been to prison for a year or two or however long. We're actually going to end up spending billions of pounds to lock people up, and at the end of it, they are not going to be any different in terms of the way that they think and the way that they justify their behaviour than they were at the beginning. And that, for me, is the fundamental catch-22. The more you criminalise, the more you imprison, the more you're going to have to do it in the future, because you're going to create a group of people who really are fit for nothing. Because once people have been to prison for 2 or 3 or 4 years, the chances of them coming out and just getting a job and living a law-abiding life are almost nil. So these are the problems: getting tough, longer sentences. And the same applies, when you analyse, why are people involved in drug offending or robberies and other kinds of financial crime, which, often are driven by the desire for drugs or being involved in the drugs trade. It's not, if you were to halve all those sentences just because you perceive them as being less harmful than another group of sentences, then that's going to have an impact somewhere on the drug dealing and on those behaviours. If you suddenly send out the message that we're imposing much lower sentences for these crimes. So I think in the end, it all comes back to that issue of, let's get the experts, people like yourself, people who are experts in the psychology of stalking and the psychology of domestic violence and the reasons it happens, and let's try and find ways to intervene as early as possible and to have a series of assessments and steps, which if someone doesn't follow it, there may be severe consequences. But if they do follow it and the stalking stops, and they have to sign up to a sort of program of awareness and education around what the impact of their stalking as an alternative to going to prison, if that works, that's better than simply sending people to prison for them to carry on committing the same acts in the future, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. But I'm also with you on getting in early. And I think that's, once again, boils down to resources and education, because that's not happening. And because of the lack of resources, victims are approaching, the police, or they're not, because they don't think anything will happen. They fear making their abuser angrier. And it goes on and on and on. So if we can nip it in the bud earlier, that means that the victims have to be taken seriously, and the wheels have to be set in motion, like right from the start. When they first report, they have to trust that they'll be believed and that something will happen, because, so many people lose their lives, and there's been no physical abuse, but rather ongoing coercive control. And stalking goes hand in hand with coercive control. And that if it had been caught early and it had a negative, and I'm talking a really negative impact on the abuser, maybe they would stop. But it's not being taken seriously earlier. So I think, and once again, I think that's resources. We need to get these abusers first point of call, and we need to believe the victims and have those assessments done. But that takes money, because you've got to go through people's phones, and these people are really clever. They attach things to their cars, they put apps on their phone, they know where they're going, they're listening to their conversations. It takes a lot of time, and that means a lot of money.
It does, but I think, there is a problem. This is another problem with trying to use the criminal justice system as your tool to try to achieve changes of behaviour. Because you said that we have to, the system effectively has to believe the victims. Well, no criminal justice system can work like that, because for obvious reasons you have to prove that someone committed a crime. So you can't simply believe someone who comes into a police station and says, I've been the victim of domestic violence, or I've been the victim of stalking. By default, believing them is going to lead to problems, because there are a number of reports, a percentage of every year of reports made of this type of behaviour, which are false and which are untrue and false complaints. And so,
people make malicious.
But exactly, malicious complaints, or even, the perpetrator actually reporting their victim, and, kind of muddy the water. So the criminal justice system, it doesn't deal very well, or certainly very quickly, where there is a big dispute about what happened and a disagreement about what happened. And so I think this brings me back to the idea that the criminal justice system, much like for many other issues in our society, is simply the wrong place. to be dealing with these things. If someone is a victim of domestic violence, they should, or stalking, they should be able to access support services, regardless of whether they're telling, whether someone believes them, whether or not they can prove it in court, etc. They should still be able to access support in the form of, support to, a lot of the social media companies, of course, could be involved in some of this protective behaviour, because there are it's not as straightforward as simply pressing a button to suddenly not have contact from someone. As you say, they can find ways around, if you change your phone number or your accounts or so on, people can find ways around that. Well, the system, we should have in place as a society resources to support someone, to maintain a blackout, to avoid them being contacted on devices or via social media. And the social media companies should have to have some role and responsibility in that, because they are being used as the vehicles for much of this controlling, coercive and stalking behaviour. And so I think you've got to look at all the practical ways in which you can protect a victim, which means that you stop someone contacting. Whether or not it's a true allegation of stalking, in a sense, doesn't matter. If someone says, I don't want to be contacted anymore, this is the history, let's find a way to support them, to keep their perpetrator away from them, both physically and electronically or digitally, and give them the kind of resources they need to kind of live a life without the stalker in their life, whatever that looks like. And if we look at it that way, rather than let's get the police to do an investigation and to analyse everything and try and prove a case in court, which is such a rare event, it just happens so rarely, as you know, anyway, as we talked about earlier. I think we might start to see that also we give a voice to victims as well. I think by recognising that this is such a widespread issue, that it needs our society to support people in a meaningful way with real resources around victims. Yeah. It changes the narrative. I mean, lots of people do have the view, don't they, that, well, it's only messages, only words, it can't really hurt you. It's, why do you care about someone posting on social media? And some people do have that kind of attitude. Yeah. And so I think we need to kind of find a way to acknowledge that, cyber stalking, as you called it earlier, is a very significant and damaging issue for many, many people, probably hundreds of thousands of people in a country as large as the UK. And we have to acknowledge that it's a problem, but we also then have to say to ourselves, we don't have, another 100,000 police officers to investigate every single report of this. So how do we use that large amount of money that is needed for this problem most effectively to support victims? And I think that's actually really difficult. It's very challenging, and it requires a really difficult and grown-up conversation as a society as to what we expect from the government, to the degree to which the government can support and help victims in this area, and what basically is outside of scope, that we just don't have the resource or the skill set to deal with it. And yeah. I think so much is understood. There is so much more understanding now of the insidious impact of cyber stalking and coercive and controlling behaviour, that I think there's enough ingredients there for us to put together a program which would allow victims to be supported and look to divert perpetrators at the very first sign. I don't just mean physically dangerous, but mentally and psychologically dangerous as well for victims. How do we divert someone from that path at the earliest stage? Because sometimes these behaviours start even amongst teenagers. You have teenagers who increasingly are using social media to stalk people, whether it be as part of a relationship, or simply because of hatred or some other reason to stalk and abuse somebody. So how do we, it happens in schools, it happens amongst mid-teenagers and young teenagers. So how do we step in at the beginning and make clear to young people that this type of behaviour is not tolerated and not acceptable, and also that it's deeply damaging to the individuals? Because I think lots of kids, in inverted commas, under 18s, under 16s, under 14s even, just don't have the maturity to understand how damaging this sort of thing could be. So we've got to educate our children and young people, and as soon as there's a sign of any inappropriate cyber behaviour, there's got to be ways and means that can be brought to parents' attention, or there can be some route to try and educate those who cross the line.
Yeah, I totally agree that there's got to be education starting at look, the start of high school at the very least around domestic violence, coercive control for victims and abusers, and cyberstalking, because that's just a huge part of children's lives. I probably do victims a disservice, Chris, in talking so much about justice, because what I really think that victims want is just for it to stop. That they want to go to the police and say, can you just make them stop? I don't care if they go to jail. I just want them to stop. And if the police, with all the best intentions, don't have the resources to look at the pattern of behaviour and look at the phone, and maybe it's flowers that are being sent every week that's unwanted. It's really creeping that person out. If that's not being looked at, then how do we make the victim feel safe? I don't want to victim blame here.
I think you're making a really good point here, because I think victims being safe is what it's all about. And for me, I think the way to make victims safe, I think, is to bring in much more readily available processes whereby, if a perpetrator admits at the outset that they have been responsible for this behaviour, and if they agree to sign up to, an undertaking that effectively, if they send flowers or they do whatever the repetitive behaviour is again, that they will sort of be guaranteed to be arrested and spend some time inside. That might be worth looking at, because then you're saying to people, okay, it doesn't matter whether you admit you did it or you didn't do it. If you sign this piece of paper saying I definitely won't do it again, and I agree that if I do it again and get caught doing it again, then there are going to be serious consequences for me of one kind or another. Then there's a better chance of deterring through that route than there is through the current system, which is that there's a complaint to the police. The perpetrator may, in a small number of cases, be arrested and at some point questioned about it, and they simply say, no, it's not true. Like she sent me loads of messages, I sent her loads of messages, just the way that we are. And that kind of standard explanation that it was all part and parcel of a relationship and there's nothing wrong with it. That's what's going to happen when you have an adversarial criminal justice, prosecution versus defence. If you have a system that is about how do we actually stop this, and as you say, how do we get this victim away from the sources of anxiety and very, very serious impact of this behaviour, and how do we actually and effectively deter perpetrators, on a case-by-case basis. And at the moment, that deterrence, that kind of engagement, that recognition that we're going to have to make those difficult choices. If someone signs this piece of paper, the consequence is they won't go to court, they won't be prosecuted, but possibly in more cases, the consequence will be that they will learn that they need to stay away from this person, and that's what we really need to achieve. And there are some, the majority of stalkers, statistically speaking, that will eventually stop. Like one way or another, something will stop them. There is a small number that will carry on doing it forever, regardless of what you do. So there are those who engage in this behaviour over short term, or when a relationship ends, for example, and then they meet someone else, and then that interest in the previous partner falls away. Whereas there are others that become obsessive, and it can last for decades or a lifetime. It's recognizing, I think, at the early stages what you're dealing with. Is this someone who is predisposed to behave like this regardless of whatever happens to them? And if so, we do need to have very clear processes to take those people physically out of circulation through being charged and remanded in custody, if necessary, in prison, pending a trial. But for the majority of cases that don't fit into that utterly lifelong obsessive category, there are diversionary methods that can be used and protections that can be put in place to nip it in the bud right at the outset, make the position crystal clear as to what someone's facing if they persist with the behaviour. And many of those cases do, when you look at alternative or diversionary approaches to these issues, do actually stop the person from stalking that victim in a way that no criminal justice investigation, full-on trial. I mean, I've done these cases. As a lawyer, I've defended in cases of coercion control and this kind of criminality. And I've seen in those cases just how, in some cases, defendants actually, they find the process of the trial is another form of coercion and control, because the victim has to give evidence in the courtroom.
they get the victim in court and they've got an audience who they think they can manipulate.
Yeah.
And they
don't care if they lose either. That's the thing. Even if they lose the trial, they'll go, they'll go and do their time or whatever, however long their sentence is, and they don't care, and they'll come out again because there is a certain small stubborn minority who will not stop this behaviour almost regardless. And my view across the criminal justice system is that that's what prisons are for. Prisons are actually for people who represent a clear and present danger to others, physically, psychologically, or in some other way. They are dangerous if they are outside of a prison setting. But most people involved in this kind of behaviour would stop doing it if we were to intervene and to create a fork in the road where they can see clearly that if they carry on this way, they're going to end up being imprisoned and their life's going to be over it. But if they go this way and they avoid this person, within months or a year or so, their life moves on, and that whatever the trigger was isn't necessarily a lifelong characteristic. Because it's not the case that anyone who's ever kind of stalked someone, if you want to call it that, if someone who sent messages that are unwelcome after the end of a relationship, not every such person is going to carry on doing that for the rest of their lives and carry on. And so long as people stop doing it, that is more important than anything else. The most important thing is that you look to stop the behaviour and protect the victim.
But I think, once again, resources, because police aren't psychologists. They don't have that area of expertise. So you would need to look at each case, as an individual case, because the reality is that most stalkers don't start off with the really hideous stuff that's really impacting in a huge way on their victim's life. It starts off small, and I think this is why victims don't report, because it starts off small. That's the nature of coercive control. So how do we pick, without that expertise, that mental health expertise, how do we tell that handful of stalkers who are going to go on and their obsession potentially is going to end the life of someone, from the majority of stalkers who, if they get a slap on the wrist and told you might go to jail, that they'll stop? How do we distinguish that?
You make good points. And I think you're absolutely right. For me, this is twofold. One, I think when it comes to young people, as we were talking about earlier, I have teenage kids, and I see that what goes on in their schools and what some of the behaviours are, particularly with boys, but not just the boys, in terms of bullying and in terms of cyber bullying, and that kind of idea that you can use social media as a means of bullying, in a way that in the past, when I was a kid, bullying was a sort of physical activity almost entirely. Yes, there was gossip and there was other kinds of meanness as well, but now it's become industrialized by social media. And so I think the first element of it has to be, we have all of these subjects on our curriculum that people have to do. They have to do Shakespeare, they have to do all sorts of things which on the face of it, in the real world, are less important. Well, listen. Everyone can have different views about the intrinsic values of certain subjects, but maths versus English, etc. There's a time-worn debate, but the truth is that in the cyber age that we live in now, and the social media age that we live in, safety online and the dangers of that can happen to people online, but also the impact that you or that young people can have on others by the behaviours which they may not quite have the maturity to understand the impact of cyberbullying to the degree we've had sadly so many tragic cases in Britain of young people committing suicide, young women, young men, gay, straight, a whole range of of young people who have been cyberbullied and tormented to the point of committing suicide. And those stories make the news. They are tragic when they happen, but I don't think the average 13, 14, 15-year-old in Britain really has been properly and objectively and clearly educated. And I don't think even parents understand. I'm sure that as a parent, I don't fully understand the cyber lives of my children. I don't understand exactly who they're communicating with, why certain things seem to be very upsetting when they happen in their world, and why other things are not, because it is very different to the lives that we have in these mega computers in our pockets when we were that could communicate with anyone and anywhere in the world instantly. We didn't have any of those things. But once you have those things, you have to have education around the dangers of those things.
Absolutely.
But to come back to your question, your main point, which was what do we do because the police are not trained? That's in a way, that's my point. The police are not really trained in this. They should be. There should be more specialist officers for those extreme cases who are fully trained in the psychology of stalking and all of the other kind of stuff that goes with it and the behaviour patterns. Of course, there should. But I think there is an argument for having non-police teams of psychologists and therapists and sort of an intervention process which actually can divert a perpetrator straight into a service where everyone there has heard it all before. Everyone knows, the same excuses, and they know the behaviour patterns and they know the psychology. And immediately someone starts to come out with the usual kind of excuses and everything, in which we all know stalkers often have the same range of excuses and reasons why they're doing it. Generally because they're in love, and they have this idea that when someone has rejected them or ended a relationship, they didn't really mean it, and it's just part. So all of that, resource, I think, should be in place, and you look to create a separate budget for interventions which are intended to have a rapid impact on the life of the victim and a very, very serious warning and challenge. And we just don't have those things. And once again, I'm not sure that the police and police officers, given that everyone associates the police with going to court, prosecutions, criminal cases, going to prison, we in some ways, I think we need to divert away from all of that and look at how do we just basically stop the behaviours? How do we protect the victims? And I think crack squads, if you like, of intervention teams in areas particularly where there's a higher prevalence of stalking complaints and stalking victims, that I think that would be a very, very wise investment of public money, which would in the long run would save a lot more than we spend on police, courts and prisons.
Oh, absolutely. Education starting in school, I think, in particular, cyber stalking, it's kind of been diluted in that people troll. That my teenagers just go, that's a troll, mum. That's what people do. And it's really, they minimise the impact that those trolls, which are essentially stalkers, they go around trying to make people, feel really bad about themselves. And sometimes it's really it's consistent. And this is what we need to teach in schools clearly, so that the kids are, being able to differentiate between, unwanted behaviour that hurts other people and behaviour that is not unwanted, because that's what it's all about. Stalking is about, it's emotional abuse. It's about unwanted behaviour, whether it's sending you perfume and flowers, or if it's a female stalker, sending you good morning and good night, sweetheart emails, whatever it is. It's unwanted, and that's what we to teach our kids in school.
Well, that's true. I think we have to kind of also acknowledge the realities of the world online and the sort of digital age, which are that, realistically, if you allow, children to have these devices, as we all do, and these devices can connect to the whole planet, and they can connect to any form of nut job, to coin a phrase, that might be deciding to stalk children, they could be anywhere. I mean, and you can't control what goes on in Chile or South Africa or for example, Australia when you're in the UK. You can't, so I think there's also a lot of education needs to be done for parents to understand, how to impose controls on their particularly younger children. But, how do you stop them just being exposed to this stuff? Because a lot of these cases of stalking and cyberbullying that have led to teenage suicides, the parents had no idea any of it was going on. They didn't know that this kind of activity and this kind of bullying was going on whilst their son or daughter was sitting up in their bedroom at home. And I think parents just don't, of an age at least, don't necessarily educate everybody about the dangers of those devices, and mainly in the case of young people, it is their phones rather than computers or other devices. It's straight through their phone, which they carry with them 24/7. Sometimes literally falling asleep, with their phone in their hand whilst engaging in social media kind of communication. So it may be that much of this has, of course, the explosion in this kind of behaviour is directly related to the explosion in the use of phones, smartphones and social media. And a lot of this may well be that we're simply not caught up in terms of our ability to understand these things and to parent our kids and to educate our kids. We haven't caught up with the technology. So we're still kind of living in a sort of analog world where, bullying, etc., was a very physical face-to-face activity. For many parents are still of that generation. And yet our kids are of a very different generation. And they for them, this kind of thing is much more normalized. And that of itself is a danger, because when you normalize bullying, you normalize very dangerous stalking type behaviors. For young people, they just consider it to be part of life. The problem is that you're never going to then start to bring it under control, because the more normalized it becomes, the more people just do it because they don't necessarily fully appreciate the consequences of what they're doing. So I think all of this education, let's educate the public more generally. Let's have public information campaigns. We have, there are many other areas of life where, alcohol use, smoking and cigarette use, and drug use for that matter, other areas where particular behaviours are damaging to people's health, and therefore the government puts out messaging and campaigns and indeed taxes that products or changes the way that products are licensed and sold to reflect the fact that they are physically dangerous to health. Well, that may well be the case. And of course, the social media companies are going to say, no, you can't restrict us. It's freedom of speech. But if freedom of speech and freedom of encrypted communication is leading to for our citizens, whether they're young or whether they're not, of all different ages, then surely we have to ask ourselves, how do we exercise some degree of control, at least in terms of access to these devices and communications being voluntary, so that it's much more difficult to communicate with people who don't want to be communicated with. There should be a sort of a cut-off button that can switch off contact from someone across every platform at once, for example, might be a technological kind of advance, and very, very quick and easy ways to shut down your world and your electronic and digital world from the influence and the interference by cyber bullies and stalkers. So some of these things are technological that require the social media companies to get behind them. Others, there are things that governments and official groups and just the public sector generally, through the health system and through the education system, can do control in a way that, as we've said more than once now, we simply can't do through the courts and through the police.
So we know what needs to happen. So we need the government to take notice and to devote clearly vast amounts of money towards this. We need more resources, because I was looking once again at the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics today, and I think I haven't got them in front of me, but I think 1 in 5 women, 1 in 15 men report being stalked, and that's I think there was something like 80 cases prosecuted in 4 years. So clearly it's not leading to convictions, but it's so prevalent in society. It's affecting everyone, because it's not just the victim, it's their families that are gathering round to support them and try and keep them safe because of the lack of places that you were suggesting out there. So it has this ripple effect where it's affecting, so many people. We need the government to throw resources at it, but that's what needs to happen. But what do we do now, Chris? Let me just tell you about, and I'm sure. Well, sorry, go on.
No, you go ahead. Ask a question. Okay. I'm interested.
Sorry, Chris. Yeah, let me just tell you about such a sad case, and I know that there's others, but just one in particular I was looking about today, a beautiful young woman called Celeste Mano. This was not an intimate partner. This was someone that she worked with 5 or 6 years ago, and she was nice to him. And of course, when she stopped it wasn't that she stopped being nice. She just ended that nice behaviour, which someone who's got those psychological problems it sees as rejection, abandonment. And anyway, an obsession developed, and he stalked her relentlessly. And she went to the police, and the police said, look, this is only 5 years ago. We don't have enough evidence. And the stalking was terrible. And she ended up changing, all the emails and her phone number, and her mother was just so stressed out. And of course she was. This guy terrorized her. Anyway, he broke into her house after they managed to get a restraining order the next time they went. And of course, that was just thrown away. Obviously, he broke into a house and he unalived her. And that the laws are starting to really look at that case, but it's still not enough. There's not enough being done. Like, what do we do for victims like Celeste, who are right now doing all the right things? They're going to the police. They're changing their number. They're moving houses. Why do the victims have to, change their lives like right now, and the abuser just gets away with it until the victim is, not here anymore?
Well, in that, obviously, that's an extreme case, and a tragic and extreme case, although not sadly not a unique case in terms of outcome. And ultimately, if someone is sort of psychologically disposed towards murder, then it's very difficult to see what could have been done in advance, other than looking to intervene at the very, very beginning. And I think really, I used this expression earlier, but putting the cloak of protection around somebody. So that does mean that they have to have access to panic alarms. They have to have direct lines to the police if somebody approaches them, and they have to have an officer or a welfare officer, whether that's a police officer or otherwise, but they had probably a police officer who is responsible, effectively for their welfare. In other words, deploying other resource as needed to protect them and to understand the patterns of behaviour that the individual is dealing with. All of that does cost money, and I'm afraid there isn't any immediate impact or magic wand solution, because you can't change the basic rules of evidence, which are well, you could, I suppose, theoretically, but I don't think anyone's arguing that you should have people brought into court and locked up without evidence to prove they've done anything. There has to be evidence, and that's the way that courts work. Whereas for interventions outside of that legal process, where you are, effectively, if someone is arrested, they are required to have an interview with a psychologist and an expert in these things. And, if they decline the interview or they don't cooperate, they can be held, in custody. So you can require people to undergo certain things, but it is very difficult in countries that have a tradition of respecting basic human rights and the presumption of innocence and all of, the right to silence and all of these other things. It is very, very, very difficult to reconcile the formalities and the necessities of a justice system with the practical reality that someone is being hounded to death by a stalker. It's a very, very difficult thing.
And getting back to evidence, that there was evidence. It's just the police looked at what they deemed as evidence, which was the thousands and thousands of calls and emails, and then changing when he got blocked here, they just make another one. They showed that evidence, and they were told that a crime hadn't been committed. So that's what I mean in turn. And you're saying too, we need to have the resources to intervene at that first point of call, because she did have evidence. It just wasn't viewed as enough. And the victim was the one who was wrapping herself in a cocoon, while the abuser was just able to continue doing what he was doing until it ended up with her losing her life. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it could be to some extent that what you're describing is as a result of laws in particular states not having caught up over stalking and coercion and control. I mean, in Britain, we've had these laws, or certainly in England, we've had these laws for many, many years now, a sort of legislation that specifically prohibits stalking in the form of, multiple, events of, it can be as, as simple as you say, as sending flowers or stuff that on the face of it in any other circumstance might be considered to be normal behavior or even quite pleasant behavior. When it's done by somebody in an unwanted and unwelcome way, it's very, very worrying. And we've all seen, movies about, historically where behaviors become frightening because of their repetition, because they're unwanted. And I think all of that is very, very challenging for the justice system. But if the law is there, then at least there is the possibility of bringing cases based on behaviours which individually wouldn't be criminalised but become criminal because they're part of a pattern of behaviour. Yeah. But you do have to have those laws on the statute book in the first place, and it sounds as if Australia perhaps is just catching up in some ways with regard to coercion control laws and the criminalisation of otherwise lawful behaviours in certain contexts. So I think getting that mindset that coercion and control is real, that it is actually as damaging as physical assaults, or if, in some cases even more so. I think that's all part of that kind of public messaging, public education that we have to get people to understand. But the more that we look at any, the irony of it is that everyone thinks they want the criminal justice system to become more effective and to become better at dealing with these things and getting people into court and getting them into prison. And actually, people don't really want that. What people really want is to stop the behaviours and to stop them at the beginning. Yeah. The last thing that most victims want is a process of a year or two or even 3, depending on where you are in the world. And in Britain, it's not unusual for it to be 2 or 3 years before a case even comes to trial. The last thing victims want is 2 or 3 years of having every message they ever sent trawled over by lawyers, and every kind of photograph that they ever took when they were in a relationship suddenly becomes fair game and evidence. Victims don't want that extra layer of scrutiny and an extra layer of kind of legal or forensic stalking, which is what goes on in court. So let's listen to victims. They don't want that. They want action quickly to stop all of this happening and to cut them off from the contact. How do we help them get that? That's what we should be asking us.
Yeah, absolutely. We need the government to take notice and prioritise this, don't we? Because essentially the victims are being told to get their own evidence, and they're a basket case, they're so full of anxiety, and they're being told, well, you go and gather your evidence, and then maybe we'll have enough to protect you. And it shouldn't be that way. So intervention early, but we've also got to make sure the victim is safe. That's number one. While the government sorts out the laws and works out what resources it's going to allocate, we've got to make the victims safe. And they're just not feeling safe at the moment.
No, well, I agree, and I think that if you make that your number one focus rather than punishment, I think you're more likely to have a system that in the end is functional from a victim's perspective. There are victims who do view justice as only being reflected by someone going to prison. There are other victims who absolutely couldn't care less about whether someone goes to prison as long as they never have to see or hear from them again. Yeah. And so if you can achieve the second of those objectives, but also you do have, of course, where people have demonstrated inappropriate behaviour of this kind, you have to, the system, society has to have an eye on whether not just the immediate victim who may have been the victim of that behaviour, but possible future victims. So exactly. I think it's really important to look at public protection as your absolute watchword when you're dealing with this area of policy. How do you protect the public? How do you protect the victims? in the present, and how do you reduce the number of victims in the future? And for me, that's all that our criminal justice system should be about, and that's all that we as a society should be about, is public protection at all times. And that comes in different forms and different ways of deterring people work differently depending on the individual. So you just have to have a system that most importantly, you need expertise. You need people like yourself who are experts in this area, who've seen and heard it all before, to be able to play a direct part in these interventions at an early stage, rather than simply hoping that overburdened police officers who might be investigating burglary one minute, drug dealing the next, and stalking the next, they simply don't have the toolkit to fully understand the dynamic.
They've got to prioritise, and what's visible is going to be addressed before something that's covert and under the radar type behaviour like stalking. So, Chris, we've been talking for so long, and I could be talking to you all night and just picking your brain. I just find your knowledge and your professionalism and just your vast amounts of awareness around this just fascinating. But have you got any last thoughts for victims who are experiencing, forget the perpetrator? I know we've got to start off by getting to them earlier so we don't have them in the prison system so they come out and reoffend. But for right now, what are your thoughts around helping the victim right now who is being stalked and doesn't know how to feel safe? They don't feel safe.
Well, it's very difficult because we don't know, and I don't know the individual circumstances of any individual victim. But I think, as a general rule, what I've observed in the many cases of this kind that I've dealt with is that the thing that makes the journey as it reduces the amount of challenge and stress is to have someone on your side. And if you, as a victim, often victims are quite secretive because they're embarrassed about what's happened, or because they feel that getting other people involved might make it worse, or what have you. But I would say, of course, look for support where necessary, particularly if there's physical danger involved and repetitive and very worrying behaviour. Look for support from the police and be prepared to kind of demand they take action. But I think equally, if not more importantly, look for support around you from close friends, from therapists, or from family in particular. So my kind of experience of watching victims go through the system is that victims find it much more possible, if you like, even to get through the system if they have someone close to them who is providing them with unambiguous support, so that they're not alone. Because I think being alone and feeling alone is in many ways one of the hardest things for victims to deal with in these cases, because they feel like they're the only one who can understand it. They're the only ones going through it. If you're lucky enough as a victim to have a very close friend, or a mother or father or sister or brother who you can confide in and share, and then they can share the load with you and support you, I think that's something I would highly, highly recommend. I appreciate that's not possible for everyone for whatever reason, but where possible, make sure that you have someone you trust on your side, and if necessary, get that person to come with you to the police station to sit with you and support you. You're entitled to have that support in this country, at least, if you need it or want it. So make sure you have it. Don't face the journey alone, because it's a very, very tough road to be the victim of stalking and try and deal with it alone. You're never alone. There's always someone, even if it's a charity, who will provide some degree of support in some way. Whatever that looks like, find the support that works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think ultimately it's about changing the system, isn't it, to stop offenders offending, which ultimately is going to, result in hopefully less victims that will need to be protected. And that needs to start in the schools. So Chris, I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. It's lovely to get a legal perspective on this, and not just coming through looking at things through the victim's eyes, but I guess holistically, we're also looking at through what we can do in terms of the offender and reducing the number of offenders so that there is less victims. So I really enjoyed hearing your thoughts and your perspective. Thank you so much for joining me. And can you just tell everyone what is the name of your amazing book?
So my book is called Justice on Trial, and it's available on Amazon and everywhere else that you can buy books. And it deals with all of the failures and problems of our system, but also tells lots of hopefully interesting stories about cases I've done, some of which made the news over the years. And so there's true crime involved, but also there's a message to it about what we're doing wrong. And if anyone's interested in other content, my YouTube channel is Chris Daw KC. And you can find my BBC One series, Crime, Are We Tough Enough, on the YouTube channel, along with lots of other content around criminal justice and one of my major passions, which is mentoring and supporting younger people who want to get into the legal profession. So there's lots of stuff for anyone who's got any interest in, whether they're in Australia or America or anywhere else, who's interested in becoming a lawyer and getting stuck in and maybe being involved in supporting victims in cases of this kind, as I myself do on a regular basis. So YouTube channel, Chris Daw KC, and you can read my book. And of course, it's also available on Audible, so you can have a listen while you're running on one of your beautiful Australian beaches.
Yes, we have lots of them here. All right. Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome. Take care. Have a great evening.
And that brings us to the end of yet another Fake Love and Flying Monkeys episode. Oh my goodness, I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with Chris, and I am so grateful and honoured that he would give me his time, given that he is ranked as a leading silk in the legal 500 and chambers and partners in the UK, one of the top KCs in the UK, and he certainly has some very high profile cases. So guys, don't forget to have a look at his book and certainly listen to his broadcasts on social media, and you can probably catch him every now and then on the Piers Morgan show. Now, if you have someone who is stalking you, guys, please reach out, go to the police, get some kind of support, and get a lawyer, jump up and down. We've got to get the word out. We've got to get more resources and more education out there so that this type of abuse is recognized as something that is just as dangerous, if not more, than physical abuse. And we can get support for victims and, of course, to stop abusers from doing it in the first place. And yeah, it certainly needs to start at a very young age, that education. Okay, guys, don't forget also, if you'd like to have a one-on-one counseling session with me, just see my website in the description, and I'd love to be able to support you in your healing journey from narcissistic abuse. On that note, it's bye from me for now. Before I go, don't forget also to get your copy of my best-selling book, Fake Love, Understanding and Healing from Narcissistic Abuse. Until the next episode, please remember, you are worthy of love, and you are worthy of so much more than a lifetime of fake love and flying monkeys.